Learning to sew an invisible zip or a concealed zip is a great skill to learn if you're new to sewing and want to make your own clothes, or even if you've already done it before but you just want to learn a few extra little tips to make your life easier when doing it. This is the video for you. I'm Ali and I've been making clothes, particularly dresses, for over 30 years. So as you can imagine, I have put in literally hundreds of zips in those years. I will say that putting an invisible zip in, once you get the hang of it, is nice and easy, but when you haven't done it before, it can seem quite daunting to get this in completely invisibly, all lined up and finished perfectly. But this video breaks it down into 10 easy steps. Just take it one step at a time. If you're about to make something and put a zip in, just get a second zip, do a practice run first. And I think you might be surprised just how much easier it is to do than what you might already think before you've had a go. So what you want is a zip that you just don't notice. So if I just turn around, you can see with this dress, I've got an invisible zip in here, and with a bold pattern like this, it's great because it doesn't mess around with the design. So I'll break it down a step at a time. I'll show you how to get your zip the right length, how to mark out where it goes, how to put it in, how to finish off the top and bottom, how to get the lining in, how to finish off a facing, everything you need to know for a perfect finish if you've got it on something like this, like a dress where it finishes at the top, or a skirt if you then have a waistband. So this is the sample that I'm going to demonstrate this with. I've used a contrast colour zip so you can see it well, and I've used a contrast thread. So hopefully everything I show you will be nice and clear. So if I just hold it like this, you can see here, this is where the zip is. And when it opens up, you can see it's not just a seam, it is an invisible zip. So let's now start at the beginning and I'll show you how I put this zip in and how I finished it all off. I'm going to show you how to do this using some different colours so it really stands out. So obviously you would normally want to have a zip that matches your fabric a little bit better than this, but I thought it would show up, and then I've got my lining as well. I've overlocked this to start with just to keep it nice and neat, and then I've put a seam here as well because quite often when you're putting a zip in, you're going to have a waist seam. So I'll show you as well what to think about when matching that up. This is my concealed zip, and the first thing you need to do is make sure it's the correct length. Now obviously I'm not actually making a garment, I'm just doing a sample, so it doesn't really matter what the length is, but I'm going to shorten this a little bit just to show you what to do if you can't get one in the correct length, because concealed zips don't come in a massive variety of colours and lengths. They tend to come in only a few lengths. So I'll show you what to do if you need to just make this a little bit shorter. I always shorten mine at the bottom and not the top. At the top, you've got these little stoppers that stop this coming up, and you're better to not mess around with those because they work perfectly. And then you've got this little bit at the top that doesn't have the teeth that will fold nice and easily into your seam allowance. You don't want to be shortening it from there and then having these teeth on there and having to pull them off. It just gets a bit tricky. So I'll show you how to shorten this from the bottom. First thing you need to do is just decide how long you want your zip. So I don't really need to shorten this. So as I'm just showing you as an example, I'm just going to take a little bit off the end of this. So I'm just going to mark a pin where I want it. So just decide on your garment how long you want your zip to be and mark it like this. And then what I've done is I've just cut a little square of my fabric that I'll use to cover the end of this, because if not, it's not going to feel very nice. And you can either do that or you can use a bit of ribbon or bias binding, just any kind of tape, anything like that that can go over the bottom here. Now the hardest thing is always filming this without getting my hands in the way and trying to sew with a phone between me and the sewing machine. But I'll do the best I can. So I've got a regular foot on for now and just a regular stitch. And all I need to do is just go backwards and forwards a few times where that pin is. And once you've done that a few times, you know when you pull your zip pull down, it's not gonna go past this. So I'm just gonna take that off there. I've used this colour intentionally so you can see what I've done. Obviously use a colour that matches. And then now that I've done that, I can just cut the end off here. You don't need to leave much excess on it. So that's now gone, and you can pull these teeth off if you want, but I don't really see the point of doing that. It can end up making a little bit of a mess of the end of your zip. But what you don't want is these ends here, because that's not gonna feel great. If you haven't got it lined, that's gonna feel awful next to your skin. If you have got it lined, you'll still risk that snagging the fabric. So this is what I use this for. So So you don't need to cut this to exactly the right size to start with, because you can always trim it down. But you just want to use this, or a bit of tape, bit of ribbon, anything you can get hold of, and just fold it over, and then just sew across again a couple of times. And that just means you don't have that horrible edge at the bottom. Once you've done that, you just need to clean this up. So I'm just going to cut it to the same width as my zip. Just make sure you don't accidentally cut the side of the zip tape. You want to keep that nice. And I can cut a little bit of that off. I don't want it getting caught up in the zip. Same on that side. And then just cut the threads off. And that's what you're left with. So if I open up my zip, you can see it stops where I've stitched it. It's not going to go past that. So that gets your zip to exactly the right size that you want. So let's have a look now at where we're going to put the zip. So this is my centre back seam, and I've got my waist seam here. Hopefully you can see that. And then what I need to do is I need to mark exactly where this zip is going to go. So I've got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance on the back here and at the top. So I need to mark that out. You can tack it, you can use chalk, a vanishing pen, whatever you want. I tend to use pins just because it's quick. If you're new to sewing, you might prefer to stitch it or draw on it, just as it stays on a little bit better than pins. But once you get used to sewing, pins are enough to mark this. And then once you get the hang of putting concealed zips in, you will just get used to how far from the edge they need to go, and you won't even necessarily need to do this stage. But if you've never done it before, it's a really good idea just to mark out where your seam allowance is. Now hopefully the pins stand out on here. If I lift it up a little bit higher, hopefully you can see it. So I've basically got one at the top, marking the position of the top, as if this was a finished garment. That would be the top of the dress, and this is where the centre back seam is. So obviously it's going to have the zip in, but let's treat it as a seam. So that's where it's going to go, and that's basically going to sit where the centre of the zip is there. This is just going to look like any other seam once it's done, if you put it in properly. So this is what I'm saying. Obviously you'd pick the best colour, which is always difficult when you've got this many colours in a print. But I'm using this zip just so it stands out a little bit more, so you can see how invisible this zip is once it's in. So you need to work out where this needs to be positioned. So where the pins are marks the centre of where the zip is there. And this pin here marks the top. And you need that to sit just above where this zip pull is here. You don't want to be pulling it down here, because then you will end up having to cut the top of the zip off, and you don't want it all the way up here, as you'll have a big gap at the top. So it needs to sit just above where that zip pull is. Different kinds of zips get sewn on in different orders. So with an invisible zip or a concealed zip, you want to sew this on before you do your centre back seam down here. For some reason, I always start with the piece on the left. I don't know why, it's just what I do. So what you need to do is you need to open up your zip now. So this is how it's going to sit when it's under there. So if I just hold that there for a second, that's where it's going to go. That zip pull is going to sit just under that pin, and that side is going to sit behind here. So I'm going to hold that with my thumb just to show you. I'm going to unzip this. You need to sew this before you do your centre back seam on both sides. So if I now flip that over, this is the position it needs to be in. So this stopper here sits just below the pin, and these zip teeth sit just to the right of where these pins are here. So I'm just going to put one pin in there before this slips. And there we go. That's how it's going to be. So once it's sewn up, that's how it'll be, and then you'll get the other side here. So what I was saying was, once you get the hang of doing this, you know how far from the edge this is. Zips are generally the same size, so I can see about 1 millimetre gap between the zip tape and my overlocking. So I know that's the distance it needs to stay down there. I don't necessarily have to follow these pins. I could use that as a guide as well. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just pin this all the way down so it lines up the same distance from here and from these pins. I've got that first side now pinned in, so I can remove these pins that mark my centre back and get those out of the way. You need to make sure when you're pinning this in that you don't stretch anything. You don't want to stretch this fabric as you're putting it on and you don't want to kind of pull the zip. You need everything to sit nice and flat. So that's now on. I need to do the other side. But what I would say, if you're using a difficult fabric, like a slippery fabric, something like that, it's probably worth tacking this in, and you could probably go a little bit closer to those teeth just to make sure this is perfect. Slippery fabrics, if you've not done it before, can be a lot more tricky. I definitely recommend doing a sample on some cotton first. So what I've pinned on there, I'm going to do exactly the same on this side. So obviously this is just a sample and I've just got 2 flat pieces. So I can just put this other side on here, and if it's twisted at the bottom, I can flip it around. But if you've already got your garment made up, you need to make sure you haven't got anything twisted. So the best way to do this is to zip part of your zip up at the bottom and then fold your seam allowance in, and you know that that goes on there. It just avoids anything getting kind of twisted up. You don't want to put your zip in and then find out you've kind of got this twist at the bottom like this or something. It's easily done. So I'm going to just pin this on here exactly the same as this side. So I've now got both sides pinned on, and now what I need to do is I need to make sure that these match up. I've got my seam here that needs to match up. I need to know it matches up at the top when it's zipped up, and I also need to go all the way to the hem and make sure that matches up. So I'm going to zip this up. So if you've got pins in it, just make sure you don't knock the pins out or get them caught when you're zipping it up. And I can now make sure everything matches up. So at the top, this matches up here. Obviously, this isn't pinned all the way to the teeth, but if I push these together here, you can see, let's lift it up in case it's not very visible. You can see this matches up here. And if I turn it over, it's a little bit easier to see that this matches up. It doesn't matter so much when you've got a bold print like this, but if you had something much bolder, like a tape on the waistband or something like that, you really want to make sure that's matched up perfectly. And then to make sure the bottom is correct, I usually just put a few pins on my centre back seam and pin it towards the zip. And then you can just make sure that you have the same amount of fabric either side. If you, let's just move the pins to show you what I mean. If it doesn't quite match up, you might have something like this. You might have one side that is just flat like this, and then a bit of excess fabric on the other side. If you've done that, then you know something's not quite right here. You just might have pinned one side on a little bit tighter than the other. So that's all pinned on, and I've double checked that it all matches up everywhere that I need to go. So now I can start sewing it on. If you don't feel confident sewing with just the pins, you can tack it on first, but it isn't necessary. Now you can use a regular zipper foot, but if you can get a concealed zipper foot or invisible zipper foot, it looks like this. You have a little hole here that the needle goes through, and then you've got little grooves down here that the zip tape goes through. So this is a Janome one, but different sewing machine brands, they might look slightly different, but they look a bit like this, and they don't cost very much. I'd absolutely recommend getting one because it makes the zip a lot easier to put in and you get a really good finish. You need to unzip the zip to sew this on. So what I've done, I've lowered my zipper foot and I've got the zip tape in the left hand little groove on here. It will be in this groove when it's on the other side. So basically the opposite side to where the opening is where you want that zip tape in. And then your needle's going to go through this little hole and it will sew nice and close. So if you've got a fabric like a velvet or something where you don't want to go too close because pile could get stuck in here, or lace or something like that, then I would recommend just sewing it without pulling this right down. But when you've got a basic cotton like this, if you can hold this zip tape down, I'm kind of flattening it out. I have seen some people ironing it down, but I don't like to do that because I want it to ping back once I've sewn it. So I just hold it down with my fingers while I'm sewing. So you just want a pretty standard stitch length. And I'm just going to start by lowering that needle in and make sure it doesn't hit these zip teeth. I'm trying not to get my hands in the way, but I need to hold things as well. So just going to start with a few reverse stitches. I'm having to stand up as I do this because I can't get to my sewing machine if not. So hopefully I'm not shaking all over the place. And then you just need to sew down it and just take your time. Just hold the zip tape down and just work your way down and just make sure nothing moves. You want to make sure the zip doesn't move from left to right. You you need to make sure it doesn't kind of slip up and down, and you need to make sure your fabric doesn't move as well. So just take your time. If you've got a machine where you can slow it down, do that if you've not done it before. And this little foot should make sure that you can't accidentally sew over the zip teeth. If you do that, you're going to ruin the zip. So I'm going to just sew all the way down to the bottom. I won't make you watch all of that because I think you're going to get a bit bored. So I will meet you at the bottom. So I'm now close to the bottom. I'm about a couple of centimetres or an inch away from the bottom. And what you need to do, and this is why you start from the top and not the bottom, because you can get closer to where this zip pull is. So you need to just basically keep sewing until you can't sew any further. And when you do the other side, because of this foot, you'll automatically stop in the same place both sides. So it lines up when you come to finish this off. So I'm not going to pull the zip teeth down now. I'm just going to let that relax. And I will just hold this straight until my zip foot hits this, which it has. And then just a couple of reverse stitches. And that's this side done. So I just need to do exactly the same on this other side. One little thing that I tend to do, if I've got a seam, like a waist seam, that I want to line up and make sure it's absolutely perfect, is when I do the second side, I just do, you can see it here, just a few little stitches that will just make sure that's in the right place. Because what you don't want to do is start from the top, go all the way down, and then when you get to that point, once you've sewn the whole zip in, see that it doesn't match up by even a couple of millimetres can just be a real pain if you want it to be perfect. So you can see there that that lines up perfectly. And now I can sew the rest of my zip in knowing that this is all going to line up brilliantly. Sometimes if you do it, it is literally off by about a millimetre. If that doesn't bother you, then that's fine. If it does, just sew this little bit first. So now that I know that matches up, I'm just going to sew this side in exactly the same way as I did the first one. The only difference now I'm doing this side is that my zip teeth are in the right hand side here. Just make sure you get it in the right side, so that means my needle will go down just to the left of these. So I'm going to get this sewn in now. That's now sewn on both sides, and you can see by just stopping when that zip foot starts touching this, I haven't had to do anything to make sure that it finishes at the same point on both sides. It just automatically, once you get to that point, you're going to have that matching. So it's great. So now you can test your zip for the first time and see how it looks. So the more you held that down, the closer you'll have got to those teeth, and the more invisible your zip's going to be. So even when I pull that with a zip that's quite a different colour, you can't really see it. So you can imagine if you've got a zip that matches perfectly, you're not going to be pulling it super tight. You're not going to see it. So this is how it should look. Once you give it a press, you're going to press this seam without pulling it, and that's going to help as well. The next thing I need to do is I need to get this back seam sewn up, and I need to just sew it up to just shy of where the stitch line is there, where I've sewn my zip in. So about an inch away, 2.5 centimetres. I'm just going to get that sewn up with a regular stitch. So I've got that now sewn up, and all I'm left with is this little gap between my centre back seam and my zip. So just make sure you've got the same amount of fabric either side. You don't want to have, like I said before, one side pulled a bit tighter and then a bit of excess. It's going to look awful. So make sure that sits nice and flat when you pull it like that. And then I think this is the fiddliest bit when you're doing this, is getting this little bit sewn up, because you want to sew up to this line. You don't want to be sewing over it, and you want a really perfect finish. So if you want to, you can machine this up to here and then hand stitch the last little bit. That's quite often what people do if they're new to this and they feel a bit nervous coming close to here. But I'll show you how I do that on the machine. So what I've done now, and you won't be able to do this if you've got an industrial machine, but I'm assuming people watching this video will have a domestic machine like this. So I've put my zip foot on, and then I've moved my needle across. So using the stitch width, I can move it over. Now I'm hoping most machines give you the option to do that, and I'm assuming they do. So I've lowered my needle in, I hope you can see this, I'm looking to see if you can. I've lowered the needle into the stitch line. So this is my centre back seam here that I've already sewn, and I'm just going to do a couple of reverse stitches there. And I don't want to line this up with my normal seam allowance mark, because obviously I've moved my needle over. So I'm going to just follow that by eye, and I basically need to now sew up and meet this bit here. So I'll just sew up a little bit first. And I'll rejoin you when I get closer to that zip because I want to take my time. So I've got a little bit closer, and what I need to do is need to make sure my zip is completely out of the way, and I need to make sure all this seam allowance is out of the way. And this is where I'm going to struggle to demonstrate because I'm trying not to get my hands in the way, but I need my hands there to hold it. So I'm holding it down, and I'm literally, luckily with my machine, it automatically stops in the down position every time. So that depends what kind of machine you've got. But I'm just doing a couple of stitches at a time, just making sure all of this is out of the way. And because I've moved my needle over to this side and I've got this foot on, I can get really close to that stitch there. So you want to join up with it and then just go a couple of stitches past it. And there we are, we're at those stitches. So I'm just going to go past literally by a couple and then do a couple of reverse stitches there. And that's it. And just be prepared that if it's not quite right, you might have to unpick that last little bit and do it again. And this is how it looks close up. It just looks like one continual line of stitching. Hopefully you can see that well. I should have used a black thread actually, so you could see it a bit better. So you can see there where it just passes it by a little bit, and it doesn't always go right first time. So just be prepared that you might have to do that a couple of times. And this is now how it looks from the right side. So as I said, it just looks like another seam. I've got my waist seam there, I've got my centre back seam there, and they don't look any different. You wouldn't know that there was a zip in there. So the next thing I'm going to do is just go and give this a really good press before I put my lining in. So I always use a bit of steam. Hopefully it won't get any condensation on the lens. So I always start with this bit here, and then just make sure this isn't like folded under or anything like that. Then flip it over, and I just give it a little light press to start with. And then once I've done that, hopefully my arm's not in the way, just hold it nice and taut and give that a good press there, and then you can hold that flat while that just cools down, and just pull it down and just do the same with this top bit here. And once that's all pressed, it really does look exactly like the other seam. You can't even see it. So before I start putting my lining in, I need to just do the centre back seam on the lining. And what you want to do is just sew it to just below where that zip is attached. So I've lined it up at the top here. I'm just going to put a pin literally about 0.5 centimetre to 1 centimetre below where the zip's sewn into, which is around 1/2 inch or just under 1/2 inch. And I'm just going to sew that little bit of centre back seam there and just press that open before I put this in. So now that I've done that bit of centre back seam, this is ready to go in. So you want this lining to be sitting like around here, so there's a bit of a gap between the teeth and the lining, because you don't want to get the lining caught in the zip teeth when you're doing it up. So I'll show you how to get that positioned perfectly, and then how to finish this top edge. Now if you're putting a waistband on this, if this is a skirt, you don't need to worry about the finishing of the top edge that I'll show you, but if you're doing a dress, your zip will go all the way up to the neck, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But let's start by getting this lining in. For the purpose of the demonstration, I've not put a seam across on the lining as well. But if you have a seam on your waist, you're likely to have it on both pieces. So just make sure they line up as well. So what I need to do is I need to put right sides together on my lining and my main bit fabric. And I need to pin the whole length down. And what I want to do, I'm going to line them up at the top here. But I'm not going to line them up here. And that's what's going to make my lining sit slightly in, and it will give me a perfect finish at the top as well. So this is about 0.5 centimetre. If you've got overlocking on your lining, it's pretty much the width of your overlocking if it's a standard size. So I'm going to pin that all the way down. I'll show you one side and then I will do the other. And once you get towards the bottom, just make sure your zip is open as much as it will go. You're going to have a little bit there because obviously your zip is slightly longer than where you stitched it to. But just make sure you haven't just opened it so far, because you're going to sew your lining in slightly wrong. So make sure that's fully open and just pin this all the way down. And then I'll show you now how I sew that in. So you can see now where I've sewn it to, that will sit just below where the zip pull is. So when you're making a dress where the zip goes all the way to the top, you might have already sewn this together where the lining joins the fabric, or the facing joins the fabric of your main dress. So just when you are doing that, if you're putting a concealed zip in, just when you're sewing that seam across there, just stop about 2.5 centimetres or an inch from where the zip is, and then we're going to finish that little bit off in a minute. So I'll show you how to do all that in a second, but let's get this lining in. So I've put my zip foot back on. Right, just move that so you can see it a little bit better. So I've got my zip foot on, and I've got my needle going down the left side of this, and I just basically want to sew that in. Let's get rid of those threads. Just make sure it doesn't get puckered up at the top, because it's easy for it to catch. I normally use a pin just to feed it through, just for that first little bit. And you want to be sewing about this distance from where you've sewn the zip in. So again, it's about 0.5 centimetre. Your zip foot will kind of dictate where you can go anyway. You just don't want to go too close, because when you're wearing this and zipping it on and off, you really don't want to get that lining caught, and you're more likely to if it's too close to the zip teeth. So I'm just going to get this sewn in now all the way to the bottom. So I'm at the bottom, and once you get there, if I feel there, I don't know if you can see a little knobble, that's basically my zip pull. You want to be stopping when you get to about there, and just do a couple of reverse stitches and make sure your zip doesn't get caught up. So that's one side done, so let's have a look at that. And there we go, that's how it looks from the other side. So that lining is now well out of the way of the teeth, and it just looks really neat and finishes that off, and it stops just below where the zip pull is at the bottom. So I'm just now going to do exactly the same on this side. This is all now sewn in, and that's going to sit nice and flat once it's pressed, and you've just got this little bit at the bottom where it's not attached. And if you want to, you can put a little snip in there. You don't want to snip too much. You can put that in there, and it just helps that stay flat. You can see this side is now a little bit flatter than this side, just by putting that little snip in that point there. So I've now just snipped both sides, and that sits really flat, and that's going to get pressed in a second. So the last bit I need to do is just finish off this top edge. So the first thing I'm going to do is just sew these right sides together at the top, and I'm going to stop just shy of where the zip is. So you might have already done this at the point that you're putting the lining in here. You might do things in different orders, but let's just get that done. So I've not pressed the top here, but you can see now that's how that's going to be when it's finished off, and you might have some understitching on there as well. But what we're concentrating on for this video is how to finish off this little piece here. Now, I did get told by someone quite sternly on one of my videos that I'd done it all wrong, because you should always hand sew it. I don't see the point of hand sewing this bit. I think by machining it, you get a better finish, and it's a lot easier. So I see no reason to hand sew it unless you're just not confident at doing it. If you've got a very, very bulky fabric, then you might want to do that. But this way is lovely and easy, and it gives a great finish. So let's just go back to the inside, and we'll do one side at a time. But you can see here, you've got this top edge done. You've got that bit done. It's just this corner that needs finishing. So let's go to the inside. So this is the inside of it here. And what you're going to have, when you're probably going to be doing this before you put your lining in the zip. I'd always recommend that, but just, it depends what order you want to do things. So anyway, you've got your lining at the bottom here, and this is your main fabric, and you're going to end up with this little bit of excess here. And that's because we've got this overlap of the lining at this point here. So if I flip that over, you'll see that it naturally curls up. And what happens is when you fold that over, it sits perfectly. You don't have any puckering at all. And this is the way the zip will be put in. If you look at any commercial things that you buy in the shop, this is how they're done. So that gets folded over. The reason it sits like that is because you've got this difference here. So I'm just going to put a pin here. And all I need to do is just sew along here. So basically just continue this line. So I'm back to just a regular foot now. I've got this lined up with my seam guide here, and I didn't really need to start that far back, but I'm just going to sew over here, and I'm just going to go across the whole thing. And if you've positioned your zip correctly, so you can see there, that's where I've sewn my zip in. Where you sew here should be just above the stopper on your zip. So you shouldn't hit the plastic. So I'm just going to go through that a couple of times, make sure it's nice and secure, and then I can cut the threads. So this is how it looks, and you need to trim this now, but I don't trim anything until I turn it the right way and make sure I've not got anything caught up. You're not going to be able to pull that out properly but hopefully you can see there's the top of the zip, that's the little zip stopper, and nothing's caught up. So to sit flat, I need to now just trim off this seam allowance. So how much you trim this really depends on what fabric you're using. If you're using something that frays a lot, you're not going to want to trim it quite so much. But I'm going to trim a fair bit off there as it's only a sample anyway, so we can see how that looks. So obviously you can go all the way along, depends how you're finishing that, but let's just do that bit for this. And then that should now turn a lot easier. Just got a little thread there that's needing to be trimmed. And you can see now I've got a really nice finish there. So I'm just going to do exactly the same on this side. And that's both sides done. And the very last thing you need to do before you press all of this and finish off your garment is just make sure they match up. You don't even want one millimetre higher than the other. If you have got it slightly uneven, all you need to do is whichever one sticks up the most, turn it inside out and just stitch slightly lower down. But you want that to match perfectly, and you can see that the zip pull lines up perfectly with the top as well. I don't tend to put a hook and eye in because one, I find it really fiddly to do them up on myself, and two, I just don't like the feel of them. But if you want to, you can also put a hook and eye to hold those together. So as I said before, if you've got a waistband, if you're doing a skirt, obviously you don't need to do this step. You'll just get your zip in and then you'll put your waistband on. So at this stage, you might already have some understitching on this bit here. If you have, you will have had to stop slightly shy of the zip. You can now finish off any understitching there. So I'm just going to quickly stitch my understitching there before I give all of this a good press. So the last little bit is just to give this a good press. So just make sure the lining is pulled away from the zip tooth there, and then I can press my top edge. You might have already done that anyway. So do that to both sides. And what you want to make sure is if you've got a fabric that might mark a little bit when you iron it, you don't want to press too hard where the top of that zip is, because you might end up with a little indentation that you don't want. So I'm just going to do exactly the same on the other side. And if you don't do this, you risk the lining going into the zip, but also it just doesn't look as good. Pressing is absolutely essential if you want a really nice finished garment. And then the last bit to do is just to press this little bit at the bottom. Hopefully my arm's not in the way here. And that just finishes that off. And you can, if you want to, put a couple of stitches holding the lining against the outer there. I don't usually do that, but that's up to you. So that's now all done. So let's go and have a look. And there we go. There's the finished invisible zip that I think really does look invisible. It is harder on more tricky fabrics. A cotton is always easier. It molds nicely. Any synthetic fabrics or slippery fabrics are going to be trickier, but you'll be able to do it with a bit of practice. So if we look at the other side, now it's pressed, it all just looks really neat. Depending on what your design is, you might have a facing there which is the same fabric as the outside, or you might just have the lining. That's just down to the design that you're doing. And as I said, if you've got the same seam on your lining as your outer, just make sure those line up as well. But that's now all done, so we can see when it opens up from both sides, that's how it looks on the inside, and then on the outside, a really nicely finished invisible zipper. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and you have either learnt a new skill or improved on a skill that you already have, and you now feel really confident doing concealed zips in anything that you might make. It's a great skill to learn because using this kind of zip just gives a really professional finish to anything that you make. If you've enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out my other tutorials and subscribe because I put new tutorials up every week.